Welcome to the ACMP Global Connect 2022 conference, whose title this year is Embracing the Changing World, Diversity, Technology, and Adaptability. Our topic for this annual conference is on managing organizational realignments through a behavioral science lens. As with any presentation at ACMP, we are in alignment that the information and presentation shared today is an expression of our insights on the topic and not necessarily of ACMP. I won't read the rest of this text, so if you'd like to dive into the details, I welcome you to pause and review here. Moving right along, let's get into some introductions. First off, thank you for attending our session today. My name is Riley Smith, and I'm based in Portland, Oregon. I have 10 plus years of experience working in change management roles across a wide variety of environments, including nonprofits, education, retail, hospitality, among others. I am the change management director at Propeller Consulting, where I've spent around 4.5 years and get my best energy when working on projects or with teams where the change is truly new and no roadmaps exist. Having been a teacher previously, adult learning and training environments are also areas that I'm super passionate about. We appreciate you joining us, and we'd love to connect with you, so feel free to find us both on LinkedIn. I will now turn it over to Faseeha.
Thanks, Riley. Hi, everyone. My name is Faseeha Khan-Jensen, and I have the pleasure of working with Riley at Propeller Consulting. I started my change journey in the nonprofit sector as well, working on water and sanitation projects and just understanding how we could make latrines specifically aspirational for people and then start to build in behavior change tactics to encourage them to continue to use latrines. I then dived into knowledge management at a business expansion firm and then was lucky enough to land at Propeller. So moving right along to our presentation, I'll go ahead and walk through our objectives for today's session. So we want to define and assess elements that are typically found within a reorg. A good deal of the work happens post-realignment, and so that's where the bulk of our energy will be focused today, but we will talk through all of the various elements of a reorg. We'll also define behavioral science principles and tactics, including mentalization, empathetic thinking, and mindfulness. Then we'll start to connect all this information together to frame organizational change methodology through behavioral science principles. And then finally, using these insights, we'll identify the most relevant and applicable change moments within organizational realignments. So what exactly are the change elements for organizational realignments, and why do they matter? The pandemic was a huge disruptor for how we conduct business and work across companies. But even pre-pandemic, we were seeing an increase in reorgs within companies simply because industries were being disrupted by innovations and innovators that required companies to respond, often by reorganizing or reshuffling their current state. Post-pandemic, this trend doesn't seem likely to change. And so there's a real business case to be made here for focusing on and understanding how to make realignments as successful as possible. Yet, according to a Harvard Business Review study, 80% of reorgs fail to deliver the anticipated value in the time planned for the reorganization. Additionally, 10% of these reorgs cause real damage to a company. These two elements combined can make for a less than ideal employee experience, which brings us to the final figure you see on the screen. Because many of these reorgs do not take into account the human element of change, 60% result in a noticeable reduction in productivity as employees try to navigate the change. During the pandemic, 58% of leaders reported that their organizations had gone through a realignment. So at a time when employees were facing great personal change, they were also facing change at work. And 44% of leaders said it was likely that a restructure would occur in the future. So we're not seeing any kind of a decline in the change that is happening for employees all around them. So this should be, an area of great focus for us as change practitioners and change leaders, and that's why we're here to speak to you today. We did a poll of our audience to see what words come to mind when you think of a reorg. And just looking at this screenshot, you can see there's, it runs the whole gamut from positive to neutral and then largely negative. So in the more positive camp, there are some people who see it as an opportunity or it makes them hopeful. And then there are people who make the business case for it. So it's just, part of business, it's what we do. But a large amount of the words on the page that we see are things like messy and chaos and confusion. So there's this connotation that a reorg can often be a negative and stressful time for employees and a business. And that's really what we want to try and get after today, is knowing that there is this connotation around a reorg. How can we help our employees transition through the change to the desired future state? So what are the elements that make up the realignment? You have before the reorg or pre-realignment, during the reorg or the actual realignment, and then after the reorg or post-realignment. The pre-realignment phase consists of the organizational design phase. So you ask questions like, what do we need the future shape and size of the organization to look like in order to support the desired future state? Then once you determine the actual design of the organization, you then as leaders move on to ask questions like, what are the capabilities, skills, and roles that we need to realize the future state? To answer that question, you'll often conduct talent assessment to determine where, if anywhere, your current talent will sit within the new future organization. You'll also ask and answer questions about where the gaps in talent are, and can we source that talent internally to fill those gaps, or do we need to hire external talent? And that's where a lot of the rub comes in, is determining how to fill those talent gaps. Once those talent assessment and assignment decisions are made, you then move on to the next phase, which is the actual reorg, where as change practitioners, we ready leaders and partners for employee conversations. So typically these are a range of conversations depending on the type of reorg. So it could be anything to preparing leaders to have conversations about exit or severance options, or promotions and lateral moves that people may or may not want within the reorg. Just because it's a promotion, it doesn't mean that people want to be in that role or see themselves in that role in the future. So we have to make sure that we prepare leaders to have conversations with a range of reactions from the employee. So that's what we focus on during this phase. And we do this by offering training to leaders, coaching, scripts, and then tips for giving employees the space to really take in the information. The pandemic threw a curveball to a lot of leaders because they were having to have these conversations via Zoom, and it's harder to pick up on cues and that human emotion. So really just tapping into ensuring the leader can pick up on any nonverbal cues and allow employees to really take on that information, whether it's in person or via Zoom. Once leaders are prepped for conversations with employees, we begin the work of notifying teammates of where they sit in the future organization. Typically, there's a lot of energy and movement during this phase. For many, it can be a time of anxiety and fear. For some, it's frustration. And then for others, there's joy and excitement that movement is happening around this. But typically, you see a lot of emotions during the announcement and notification phase of the reorg. The next phase, or after the reorg, is really where we see a lot of organizations fall flat. They do a bunch of work to ensure that they have the design map and that they notify employees of where they sit. But then they get to the work of just saying, oh, people will figure out where their role sits in the new organization. And what we know is that's not the case. We have to take concerted effort to ensure that people understand where they sit in the new organization. So a lot of leaders and organizations don't dedicate enough time or resources to moving their teams through this transition, because it is a transition from their previous state to the new future state that we're trying to achieve. But we want to be sure that we build out that element of onboarding to the new world. So who's your new team? or your manager even. You may not know that information. You may just be finding out for the first time. What's your new role? Are your responsibilities the same? And it could even be simple things like, do you sit in the same place at the office if you're returning to work? Or have you moved? Did you move to another floor? Does that have implications for how your employee will feel about the reorg? If we then move to the final element, as the new organization activates, how do you take on this new role in the new organization in real life? So you've been told on paper that these are your responsibilities, but how does that water flow through the pipes as you try and work with cross-functional partners or even other members of your team? How do you know which work to continue to do and which work to let go of? And if you let go of a responsibility or some work that you used to be responsible for, who's picking up that work? These are the questions that we try to start to answer as the organization activates. So what does the change journey look like for folks? In our work, we found that what you see on the screen is typically what the change journey looks like. Leaders are always slightly ahead on the curve as they know more information and they've looked behind the curtain for a longer time, so they're anticipating what's coming next. Whereas employees move through the change at a different and slower pace. The aim is that once the announcement is made about the reorg, employees begin to move through the comprehension of what is changing and why. And then they move on to the aspirational phase of wanting to engage with the change. And in ADKAR, this is also known as the desire phase. So even though much of the reorg is still unknown to them, they have that aspiration to engage with what is happening. Next, as we approach activation, employees begin to feel ready for the change. They feel prepared because they have both the knowledge and ability, if we refer back to ADKAR, to move through the change. And finally, they reach the growth phase, which is post-activation, where they know how to operate in the new ways of working and they know how to thrive in the new organization as well. And while this change journey is pretty indicative of change within organizations, what is distinctive about reorgs that we have found in our work at Propeller is the double dip that you see here for leaders and employees, where around activation, there is a slight dip in sentiment as teammates learn more about what the future state looks like. So they may initially be excited and want to engage with the change, but as those details are revealed to them for the first time at activation, not earlier, you start to see them thinking, oh, how do I fit into this change? And so sentiment may go down. So that double dip is incredibly important as we think about what tactics we want to employ and how we want to move employees through the change with regards to a reorg. And not all organizational realignments are the same. Typically, there are 4 different types that you see here on the screen. The first is a full realignment across the entire organization. So this touches all aspects of the organization. The second type is a partial realignment. This could be for just one sub-function, one role type, or just one team. And that only affects part of the organization. The third is an organizational realignment that results in layoffs. And as you can imagine, these are particularly difficult to work through. And then finally, an organizational realignment that comes about because of an acquisition. And as we start to think about the different types of realignment, there are different tactics that you can choose to employ for all of these realignments. So the elements that we discussed earlier are presented here on the screen. And while you'll use some of these elements in your realignments and not others, depending on the type of reorg, the key issue to note is that org realignments are not like other business changes. Employees may know some of the information and they may have some kind of idea that some change is coming, but they're not read in on any of the substantive details of the reorg until after activation takes place. So their knowledge of the change is happening much later in the process compared to many other business changes. So this makes creating awareness, generating buy-in, and enabling the overall change all the more difficult. And it's also the reason why we should seek to understand the behaviors that drive employees so that we can create the right moments of engagement to transition them through the change. By understanding the behaviors, we can anticipate how people may respond and ensure our change tactics fully address those behaviors. Riley will now speak to this in more detail.
Wonderfully explained. Thank you, Faseeha. Now that we've learned a bit about the nuances of organizational realignments and why it's such a difficult change management scenario, we wanted to provide an introduction to some behavioral science concepts that may be useful to have for your change management toolkit. To kick us off, let's see some common examples of how our decision-making is often influenced. And this is very popular in the e-commerce kind of e-marketing world. On the left, do you see what tactic is being used here to get your email address? By checking the box, pre-populated checking that box that reads, I'm okay with getting emails, etc. This company is setting the default to be the desired outcome, requiring you to uncheck the box. This is called the default effect within the behavioral science world. What about the middle? This one's a bit less obvious, but what do you think is in play here for guiding you towards a shoe purchase? Here, by allowing you to build your own personalized shoe, you have more buy-in to the overall outcome. This is a combination of something that's called foot in the door, as well as the IKEA effect, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And finally, on the right, there's a lot going on here. Scarcity, limited choice, and a bit of loss aversion, all heuristics that influence your decision-making and are encouraging you to click that green button. Now that we've seen a few live examples, let's dive into the theory a bit more and some of the concepts. Behavioral science has definitely become more popular over the past decade with best-selling books, as you see here, and popular researchers and authors like Kahneman, Tversky, and Thaler, to name a few. And you see it being utilized across industries as seen in these stories on the right. In short, behavioral science theories investigate and explain the effects of psychological, social, cognitive, and emotional factors on the actions we take and the decisions we make. And over the course of the past decade plus of research, we've expanded our thinking on how decisions are made. On the left, and commonly found in kind of your classical economics training, we assume humans are rational thinkers who have perfect information and unlimited time. Let's pause. Do you all believe you are rational thinkers who have perfect information and unlimited time? I know during organizational realignments that all three of those are likely untrue. Behavioral economic theory on the right recognizes that our environment influences the way we act, often irrationally, by the way, and seeks to understand the real way people behave. So having this kind of academic background, that was potentially the last academic slide there for y'all. We can consider some common tools that guide people to act more rationally, namely in the face of transformational changes. We've included 3 here as an overview, but we'll focus mainly on the latter, the bolded one, heuristics, throughout the presentation. Quickly, as a concept, neuroplasticity is a concept you should be aware of. In an individual, focused attentions and choices made in the mind can eventually affect the physical makeup of your brain. The more frequent pattern of mental activity that occurs, the more entrenched the associated pathway becomes in your brain. How does this look for organizations? Well, if you have focused and intentional change management throughout a change and previously with other change programs, that can generate patterns of mental activity that provide measurable benefits up to and after this reorg. This is applicable to large organizations who may do many reorgs as their business grows and adapts, or maybe an org that does a lot of acquisitions and can be often referred to as change muscle, something that we often hear in the practice. Mentalization and mindfulness is a practice that teams can implement, and we'll do an activity later. The ability to interpret human behavior in intentional mental states while being self-attuned to one's mental activity can lead to kind of a heightened authenticity. Replicating that to scale within teams or an organization provides endless change opportunities. This can be seen often in providing space for people to process changes and intentional guided activities that allows their thoughts to be processed, reflected upon, and shared in a purposeful manner. You can imagine this being super beneficial during conversations, during teaming exercises, during activation, as folks are still coming to grips with the organization redesign that has occurred. So again, those two are concepts that we wanted you to be aware of. What we really want to do is focus a majority of our time today on tools that you can use within your change management strategy, and that is around heuristics. Heuristics involves kind of a discussion on rapid change, right? And it activates what Kahneman called fast thinking portion of the brain, which leads to this unconscious instinctive processing. These can generate often negative reactions to the change, lead to rumor mills, and negate most of the work done throughout your change management efforts. We'll focus on these for the rest of our session, as companies often expect or come to terms with the bad consequences that will normally dilute with over time, rather than do the intentional change management to address these normal reactions. Here is one example. The IKEA effect, as I mentioned earlier, is demonstrated with the very popular meal kits. Because you're part of the building process, like most IKEA furniture, you tend to have a more positive association with the end result, in this case, the meal. How could this heuristic apply to org realignments? Think about that, and we'll cover that later on in our example. As mentioned, there are an endless amount of heuristics. In this image, you'll see a really well-designed diagram from a company called Cognitive Load. The website is COGLODE.com. We don't have time to cover all of these, and in our attached PDF to this presentation, we've included this menu for your perusal. So we'll highlight many of them here that we think can be useful during org realignments. We'll cover 6 in detail here shortly, but it may make sense to pause here on this slide or even on the previous slide to take a quick read through these. I think this is a great menu for you to have in your back pocket, one that you could print and again, have as part of your change toolkit. Perfect. Hopefully you paused and took a read through those. But if you didn't, let's pick 6 that we think are worth profiling. Let's talk about framing first. How choices presented to you and how information is framed can influence decisions that we make and how we feel about the situation in front of us. This image is powerful in that it's saying the exact same thing, but you can imagine which one most people would select without thinking. The 80% fat-free is more enticing and more positive than the 20% fat option. How we communicate the reorg in terms of announcements or timelines, for example, is a choice of how the information is framed. And we can talk about that a little bit later in our example as well. Our second example is endowed progress. As seen here, once you've started the journey in the form of coffee loyalty here, you're now artificially moving towards a goal they created for you. In reorg, this is relevant as you potentially talk about a timeline in that wherever you are in the journey, the amount of work that has previously been done is well recognized, well documented, and well acknowledged, so that everyone who, depending on your level of awareness and buy-in, is bought into the overall arc of and story that folks are on. That previous one is very closely related, this one, sorry, is very closely related to the foot in the door, where you have someone make a small commitment in that journey, such as attending an informational event or an all hands as an example. In this example, you've agreed to sample a small chocolate with the hopes of coming into the store to see what other chocolates are available. Next thing you know, you're now walking out with a small box. So again, in reorgs, just attending an informational event to get a little bit of awareness can help them get that foot into the door to be more accepting to the idea that this design is good for the organization. Moving right along, prospect theory is very similar to loss aversion in that when we're given a choice, folks place more weight on perceived gains than perceived losses. Purchasing insurance as the example here. This is super helpful for us in reorgs, particularly as it comes to storytelling and narratives. Losses are associated with reorgs. We saw that in the word cloud earlier, and generally lead to these negative connotations. Framing the information up as gains rather than losses, if that is the authentic truth, right, is helpful reference points for employees. Our fifth heuristic we'll profile today is autonomy bias. People have a need to control their situations, which is the opposite of what a reorg often does. Again, as Faseeha mentioned earlier, during that pre-alignment, there's often little information that can be shared and a lot of behind the scenes that is happening. That's a lot of lack of control for most employees. This is really innate who we are as a people, and it has been on display with kind of our new approach to working in a remote hybrid style, as shown here in this cartoon. In reorgs, think about how you can give your employees some autonomy, some locus of control that allows them to be a part of the process. This could be bringing in subject matter experts throughout certain stages of the org, or how you involve them post day one, as Faseeha mentioned, often something that is left kind of by the wayside to just say, hey, they'll figure it out. But it's about giving them control and autonomy in those situations that can be of help. The final one we'll profile today with our short time is commitment bias. People have a tendency to remain committed to their past behaviors, even if it's not desirable. In this image, people who share their commitment verbally to another, for example, I'm going to the gym 4 times a week. When they do that when making goals, they're more likely to follow through. In reorgs, how you establish commitments for leaders and employees, potentially on paper, could be powerful before the reorg, thinking about like engagement principles, how we'll kind of behave, how leaders will show up for them, how that happens during, providing that space during those conversations. And again, that emphasis on after, when the awareness is finally come to fruition that you're building desire and knowledge and ability with how we are to act in the reorg, that commitment, or what we often call rules of engagement, can be helpful during that time as well. That wraps up again, we had that big menu and we didn't want to just kind of boil the ocean there. I wanted to give you 6 really live examples of how those can be impactful during reorganizations. And wraps up kind of our quick synopsis of some popular heuristics and our behavioral science review. Before we leave this section, we wanted to provide space for some mindfulness. We thought this would be a good spot, as we'll be transitioning from us doing the talking to you actively integrating these concepts with common change moments within a reorg. Before we pass the baton to you, let's do a simple breathing exercise. What I'd like you to do is plant your feet on the ground and sit up straight. I want you to feel the floor beneath your feet and your body in your chair, grounding you to the earth. For the next 90 seconds, close your eyes and listen to the sounds around you while taking a slow breath in and a slow breath out. What do you hear? Birds, leaves blowing in the winds, your kids or family members at home, colleagues in the office. If your mind starts to wander in these 90 seconds, simply bring it back to what you're hearing and your breaths. We'll go off camera now and give you that 90 seconds of deep breaths in, deep breaths out, paying attention to what you hear. All right. Faseeha, how are you feeling?
You know, I feel very present and very engaged, Riley. Thank you for that session.
I will note the lawnmower was very present across the street. That dominated my soundscape.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Riley, for leading us through that activity. I hope that was a great moment for you all to just pause and reflect on how we can all show up and be fully present in these moments. Excuse me. So now that Riley has talked through some of the top line aspects of behavioral science and some of the tactics that we can employ, we're going to put this into practice and take a real life example. We're going to walk through the first few sections and then have you guys go off and do this on your own and apply it to your own project. And then we'll come back together to walk through that. So what we'd like to do, as I said, is take you through an exercise. We'll do what is on the screen first, just to kind of set it up and provide an example. We're going to examine various change moments that happen at different phases of a reorg, and talk through what sorts of tactics you can employ based on behavioral science and how we know employees may show up to certain moments. So if we start with the announcement phase that you see here on the screen, the first question that we want to ask is, what is the change risk at that moment that the announcement is made? What is a possible reaction that your employees may have? What are some of the things that can be challenging to you in that moment? Riley and I thought ahead through this, and something that we have experienced in our work is that people feel blindsided. They didn't know it was coming. They weren't given any information. They feel like they were told right at the last minute, and this is being sprung on them. And this lessens their productivity because they're uncertain about the impact to them or what the future looks like. Then if we move on to, what is the desired outcome? So we know what the risk is, but how do we want people to show up to that moment? How do we want to meet them in that moment when the announcement is made? It's the first time they're hearing about it. So we want to build awareness. We want to increase their comprehension, if you remember from one of the previous slides, of what is happening and what the change means for them. We want to provide them with concrete next steps so that some of that uncertainty that they're feeling is lessened because they know what is coming next. And we want to build that case for change. We want them to buy into the change that is happening. Just because it's happening later than some other changes happen doesn't mean we can't still build that case and generate buy-in for the change. So based on what we want the desired outcome to be during the announcement phase, what are some of the heuristics that we think may help? And again, if you need to take a moment here to go back through the previous slides, we encourage you to do that. But just thinking through some of the tactics Riley talked about, what do we think may help in this moment here? Again, some things that Riley and I thought through were endowed progress. And this is the idea that we're not starting from scratch. This reorg is not starting from zero. It's building on the work our employees have already done, the journey they've already been on. We're just building on that journey and getting them to a future state that will allow them to realize even more benefits than they are now. And then the second heuristic that we can employ is a foot in the door. You're revealing a little bit about the reorg. You're giving them some information about the future state to entice people to stick around for the big reveal, for that further information, those next steps. What is happening next? What is coming next? You're giving them just enough to whet their appetite so they stick around for more. And then based on these heuristic tactics, what does that look like in action? What is the actual tactic that we could take to realize these? This could be including a strategic roadmap and sharing that with your team so that people know how the work that we're doing now in terms of the reorg is connected to the broader strategic vision. And again, this is showing them that we're not starting from zero, we're building on what is already in place. Or they could attend an all hands or Q&A next week or meet the leader And that would allow them to find out more information than they know at this present moment. But they have to be on the journey until at least next week to be able to get access to that information. So those are some of the principles that we can employ at the announcement phase of a reorg. I'm going to hand it over to Riley now for some practice time.
Thank you. Thank you. And yes, thank you, Faseeha, for taking us through that one example. Here we ask that you pause for 10 minutes, 15 if needed, and visit your attached handout that came with this presentation. Alternatively, if you can't find that handout, if you want to flip back and forth through the recording to the menu provided from Cognitive Load, and this slide right here, you could do screenshots, for example. You can do this kind of on your notepad in that fashion as well. Either way, we encourage you to stop and work through these 5 moments: team discussion / all hands, rumor mill, timeline announcement, conversations, and activation, thinking about what heuristics could help in these key change moments. So we'll ask that you pause here, and as you come back, we'll then review each one in line. Awesome. Welcome back. Hopefully you're paused. If you didn't have time, happy to just kind of walk through these with you and review how we were thinking through each of these change moments. During your first opportunity to get together with your team after the announcement's been made, whether that's through an all hands, whether that's through, depending on your team size, a Zoom breakout group, whatever that be. We know that the change risk might be that reactions are visible, they're loud, there's some unease, there's uncertainty still, and we know that there might be silent dissenters, folks who didn't show up to the all hands, or folks who remain quiet in the background. As you think through why you're doing this all hand, I think the desired outcome as we see it is you want to make sure that employees felt heard, that feedback is being gathered, and that you are a voice for that change. As we know, sponsorship is important in change management, and likely that announcement came from a senior leader within the organization, and now you are the face of that change for your teams. And so being able to, again, provide the ears for your team and be able to document some steps, some next steps is helpful. And so 2 heuristics that we think that could be helpful. 1, commitment. At the end of the open forum, you could guide employees to write down principles or rules of engagement of how they'll show up for the reorg. Being very clear with them that you'll share info, and you can participate in this as well. You can be clear that you'll share information right away as soon as you're kind of given the sign off to send that information out or communicate that information, but also kind of rules of engagement for how they'll show up during the reorg. Maybe they want a monthly check-in, and that's a commitment that you can provide, or potentially they'll want some background on how decisions are being made or why this is happening. And so giving them the opportunity to kind of write down how they want to show up and how you can show up will show that you two are together in this moment. Another heuristic that could be helpful is loss aversion. And that is kind of emphasizing what the org and team gain in the reorg. Again, authenticity here matters. I think obviously when you, if layoffs were a major reason for the reorg, that authenticity is important, how you present that information. But often, as we think about building the change narrative, you want to emphasize what gains you'll get out of this change. Faseeha, anything else you would add to this one? I think anchoring could come into play, but just, give you the floor.
Yeah, I would just say that I think commitment is such a big one. Everything stems from that. I found it helpful to also have leaders write down their principles of how they'll show up in every phase of the reorg, because that carries through then to when you actually activate. And I found that to be a successful tactic to employ as well.
Love it. Cool. Let's go into the next one, which I believe is rumor mill. This will happen during a reorg. Information will trickle out, and then it picks up steam, and it starts to just appear in all various parts of the organization, and the information gets muddy real quick. And so the change risk here is just lack of detailed information causes employees to start guessing at the results, guessing at the timeline, guessing at the reason that it's happening, guessing on whether layoffs are the focus, all of these things, because of the lack of information that's often available, enables employees to start engaging in the rumor mill. And so the desired outcome is, the rumors never gain momentum, and when they do, are directly addressed. I think from a change management perspective, this is your best bet to put out those fires. And so heuristics that can be useful during this exercise, priming, again, be more current than the latest rumor by trickling comms. You shouldn't go months without talking about the reorg. You probably shouldn't go 1 month without talking about the reorg. And you should, when seeing these rumors, address them head on and provide, utilize the key messaging that you've designed for this reorg. Continue to harp on the benefits, the gains, and when available, share new information that helps address those rumors. Obviously, authority could come into place here. Having a director or a people manager address the rumors may not be the most appropriate as it relates to addressing something that is kind of organizational wide. If those rumors are, team focused, team specific, that I think that team manager, that people manager has that authority to kind of squash those rumors. But if it's kind of an organizational wide, you want to march up the ladder to the highest at the VP or C level and have that sponsor of the change address the heaviest, most damaging rumors, so that message is consistently heard throughout the organization. All right, moving on to timeline announcement. Again, often an announcement's made that a reorg is occurring. Sometimes a timeline appears with that announcement. Sometimes it's just, hey, we are working on this behind the scenes. Folks generally want to know, when does this actually take effect? When am I having a conversation? When am I potentially going to be in a new role? And without that becomes a key moment when folks are just desiring a little bit more about the change. So a lot of disappointment kind of in the lack of immediacy and kind of that prolonged waiting game is the change risk, where your silent dissenters, your change resistance, your rumors start to rev up because the timeline hasn't been announced. The goal is to build awareness, provide next steps, provide more details with what's to come, and bring that new reality a bit closer. So important in this one, we thought, was anchoring, which is definitely don't share a timeline until it's been heavily scrutinized, heavily vetted, well socialized, because moving timelines can signal a failure behind the scenes. You don't want to anchor on something the first time they hear it and then immediately, or in the future move it, because that can only bring up those negative connotations that we talked about earlier. And so when we have a timeline, let's anchor on it and let's make sure that that timeline is realistic for all parties involved throughout the reorganization. And then secondly, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but how you frame the information, right? The announcement of the timeline is one step in the event. There's all this work that's been happening behind the scenes, being able to speak to that, to speak to the level of dedication, the level of commitment, the level of time, and the leadership involvement that's been involved throughout the design or the talent mapping stages is as important as then now talking about what's going on into the future. With this timeline announcement, we now have, marked a line in the sand for when we'll be having conversations, but then you can also start to share a little bit more about the larger journey and start to emphasize some of that post design, activation, onboarding stages, and how intentional we'll be with ensuring that teams are coming together in the right ways in each individual's respective roles. And so again, announcing, hey, this design is going to happen on X date and just leaving versus providing additional context throughout the journey will begin to build that awareness and buy-in for folks as they're moving through. Faseeha, I know you've went through this recently. Anything you to add on this?
Well, I think all change practitioners love a good plan. So just, have your plan and Riley, as you mentioned, make sure that everyone with decision-making authority is aligned to the plan, understands the plan, and understands the ramifications of not sticking to the plan if you're going to announce it to your team. And also that is likely what your team deserves, is that information on next steps. So you should have that information available. But if for whatever reason not everybody is aligned who has decision-making authority, then it's probably best to hold on making any announcement, because it will absolutely send your team spinning if you announce dates and then don't hold to those. But yeah, good planning, I would say, is crucial.
And a couple other right answers. Again, we are presenting just some answers. You might have picked others. I think certainty effect. If you went back and looked at the menu, we didn't cover this. Craving certainty over chance, endowed progress. Look at how much we've accomplished. If you want to just quickly go back to the previous slide, see, I didn't give some additional ones around rumor mill, like storyteller bias. We're more persuaded by those and have better recall for those who tell good stories. I mean, humor could even be a lot, enabled for the rumor mill. We remember things we laugh at. So if it's the craziest rumor, having your VP or C-level exec just being able to call out the ridiculousness of it is often helpful. So again, we're just giving you a couple answers. There's plenty of other right answers along the way. If we skip back ahead, we did timeline announcement. Yep. And then the next one's conversations. Again, the change risk is just folks resonating with what is about to happen to their role. So lateral moves, manager changes, demotions, as Faseeha mentioned, promotions to a role maybe you're not excited for, layoffs. Any of these are unsettling and can possibly cause that disdain. And so, as a change manager, the desired outcome is that employees trust the outcome, they trust the process. They've heard about the journey all the way up until the conversations. They feel connected to at least the process and the folks who are relaying the information, as well as to the kind of the overall journey of the organization. So the two heuristics we thought that could be applicable here is reciprocity. So building in moments of gratitude for each employee. You're having a very important conversation with them. You're letting them know about their journeys. It shouldn't just be kind of a robotic conversation. There are certain protocols and processes that you'll likely have to follow with human resources, but providing that opportunity to be human, providing that space and allowing them some time to kind of move through this is important. We also have limited choice. Most changes don't come with options, unless required by HR. There's limited choice often in these, but even providing them, hey, take a couple days to think about it, it just gives them the time to actually have some of that autonomy. Another one that you could have used here, to give them some days, some space to go and reflect on the conversation and having them come back to their manager. I think prospect theory could have also applied here in terms of just speaking about the gains, particularly if we think this is a positive, lateral or promotion move, about their role in the new kind of future organization. And I think our last one here is activation. So, the change risk is, the excitement of the reorg or maybe some of the tribulations of past, and now the new reality set in. We often think about our children or students who go through school and they're super pumped about school in August and September, then the October lull hits. Very similar if you have kids who are moving through the K through 12 system, that October is a tough month. And so similarly in activation, as they get into role and they start to come to grips with their new situation, that excitement can wane. And so what can we do? We want excitement, engagement, and just kind of program sentiment around the reorg to continue to improve and build upon. So a couple of things that we thought worked together was the IKEA effect and or the autonomy bias. And that is just, how do you involve your team throughout? we emphasized in the beginning how unique this change is, and that you really struggle to build awareness and desire because there's limited information you can share. But now that the conversations happen, you should really be engaging and enabling your team through different teaming exercises, onboarding exercises. For those people managers out there, strategic direction conversations. If operating kind of model changes have changed or have occurred, involving them and getting feedback from them, doing focus group sessions are all ways that allow them to say, hey, this thing happened to me, but now I'm part of creating the new solution and operating in this new org. It's creating the spaces, the places, and the opportunities for them, for ways of working, teaming, and cutover activities is super important here. And I think the part that we've really emphasized where change managers can really have a large impact. All right, I think those are the examples. So here's the fully baked cake that you helped us create. Feel free to take this as a leave behind and consider this as you implement changes beyond reorgs. Again, these were our answers. I think if you look through the menu, you'll find many other heuristics that could be helpful. These tools, while focused on this use case, could be applied in a multitude of ways, to crafting messaging, aligning stakeholders, and enabling folks to move through changes during activation. So in summary, people will use cognitive shortcuts during large transformational changes, pending their past experiences with change fatigue, or general decision-making patterns. As a change manager, you can lean into these tools we shared with you today to ensure you're helping employees walk down the path that best enables the change for the employee as well as the organization. If not, you're kind of open to people using these heuristics and the irrational decision-making that can come with them, that we are all prone to do from time to time. We've enjoyed putting this together for you, and as mentioned in the beginning, please reach out to us at Propeller Consulting. Should you have questions about this topic, find us on LinkedIn, and feel free to reach out if you want to explore change management more in depth for your current organization. On behalf of me and Faseeha, thank you all, and enjoyed recording this for your consumption.